Welcome to the Laptops on Top of the Table podcast with
Naima Hernandez,
Khadija Nancy,
Kathleen Mahoney,
and Liam Rio, a podcast where we have somewhat civil disputes and conversations that complement the fantastic class of Mr. William James, soon to be Dr. O'Neill White. This is episode 47, Wealth and the Transatlantic Slave Trade.
Alright, so as we know, the transatlantic slave trade was the large-scale forced transport of enslaved people from West Africa to the Americas and West Indies. Manufactured goods were traded for slaves, who were then traded for raw goods that were brought back to Europe and manufactured. During this cycle, a lot of money was invested by people in Europe. That money didn't just go away. Today we'll be talking about how people profited off the transatlantic slave trade during it, after it, and even today.
So I guess to start, my one question would be, how did people profit off of the transatlantic slave trade just during the time that it was occurring?
I think you can, I guess, through just like the exploitation of slaves and then the way in which those slaves then allowed for those countries to create certain material goods and things that they could then sell. So it was just selling upon selling upon selling. And then the amount of profit that occur through that method is pretty just insane.
And profit isn't only money. I mean, people were getting goods from this. They were getting manufactured goods from it. So they could have been getting rich through goods and other things like that.
And just kind of through like the general, like you're able to exert so much power even beyond finances of just having control over a major trade route that's connecting all of these parts of the world that were previously unconnected. So if you just had a barge or something which you could access those parts of the world, you had that much more influence and that much more power beyond the financial side of things. And like owning people is crazy.
And also, like, the entire point of, like, slavery was that, like, the people that were taken as slaves, like, they weren't paid for the work that they were doing, like, on plantations and stuff. So obviously people profited, like, so much off of that because they literally weren't getting paid, so they didn't have to pay for the labor.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess you could also throw in the argument, and this is kind of a little on the darker side, or I don't know, but they did pay for the slaves, even though that payment might not have been just, or they were kind of corrupt in the ways that they were purchasing these things. Like, I'll give you 2 bottles of rum, and you give us like 20 guys. Like, it's not necessarily that that's right, but in many ways, they did pay for the slaves, so you could also maybe come to the justification, at least for like slave owners, or like, we don't have to pay for this thing because this is not like an employee. This is like a plow. We can purchase it once. We don't have to give our plow a salary. And so kind of that rationale to say like, hey, no, we purchased these slaves. Like, we purchased them. We don't have to pay them. They're slaves. Like, we bought them up front.
Yeah, like that's what I mean. Like, they weren't, like, slaves weren't, like, getting paid. Like, it's not like a job where it's like, oh, I give you money for, like, your work that you're doing, like, on the plantation or something. Like, they didn't get paid directly for that. So that's how they profited. That's what I mean when I'm saying.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And that also just furthers the idea that slaves were seen as objects and that people, I mean, if you, like how you said, a one-time purchase and then you don't have to pay anything else on it. And they just kept them until they died and then bought more. So it was never really, I don't know. So I had found something interesting about, they did an investigation of historic royal palaces in 2020 and showed that almost all property used by the Stuart dynasty in the 17th century had an element of money derived by slavery in it. So that's interesting that, like, what they're saying by that is, like, the things that they're owning in these properties are just paid for through slavery, through the transatlantic slave trade, through the money that they got from that. Which it, like, brings up the question on if that's morally right, and like if things purchased with money from slavery should be like, is that morally okay to buy something with money that you got from selling human beings?
And this was also like a really recent study, like because when Naima was researching this, it was in 2020. So obviously that shows like that the money is still there from slavery.
But
so
it's
this is
also
like
sad.
really recent.
Yeah.
So like obviously the profits from the immense profits from slavery are still in existence, and that's like proof of it.
And it's just sad that they only now did that study in 2020. Obviously, they knew where this money was coming from. I don't know. I just feel like that's something that could have been done earlier.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes it's hard for certain people to recognize the value in these like generational, not only like wealth, but also in kind of having a history of positive conqueror type experiences that have informed who your family and your blood is. And personally, as someone who's like, my mother was adopted and my grandparents were like immigrants from Spain, and they don't talk about their family. Like, we immigrated, we're done, we are now American, and kind of not having any recognition of what was before. And then also the power of having that, saying like, I know where all my ancestors came from, I know what they did, who I am in some ways based on who my family is, and also the wealth that comes from that is like being established, and like the amount of power that comes from that. Those things.
Some facts that I did gather while researching on this topic was that cotton quickly overtook other crops as the nation's most lucrative commercial product. And even though cotton was cultivated in like family farms, the quantity was most due to the family members' labor force and their need to also produce food. Those who use slaves might enhance their output and money, allowing them to purchase more and better land and additional slaves to further increase production.
Do we think that those who profited from the slave trade in Africa should face the same or similar kind of forced retribution that those in like European countries have? Because there were Africans in Africa who were profiting immensely off of selling their own people. And I think a lot of the conversation focused on like the European centric way, it's like saying they were the propagators, but there's definitely something in like Africa where like there are people that are allowed wealth, maybe not as many, but they're definitely some.
We did talk about that in class, like how, like, could you imagine someone that has been in your village or your tribe for your whole life and then they sell you for like a good rum? Like sometimes they were selling people for mirrors. So it's kind of like that feeling of I was betrayed in my, like I don't know, by my own people in my homeland. I'm being taken to this place. I have no clue where I'm going. Like who am I blaming for that? Am I blaming the people who are taking me, or am I blaming like my own people that turned me in?
And not just that, like they're in a new community, a new country, like where they have to adapt, and like them maybe not even understanding what language
Exactly.
is being spoken to them. So it's very foreign country, or foreign surrounding to them.
I think like going to like the profiting off of slavery and that, there's a lot of like practices and policies today that keep African Americans in poverty even after slavery has ended. I'm trying to think. I know what we had talked about was right after slavery had ended, sharecropping kind of came to light.
Yeah. And it's also because after you have this group of people and you force them into, you don't give them the opportunities to express or experience any other world but that of this like, planter. You are a farmhand, you are a slave. And so even the abolishment of slavery without any progressive or at least effective acknowledgement that these people needed some support to leave the world that they had been trapped in for so long, we pretty much just say, yes, you're free, but we're not allowing you to be anything else about what you were. So it's like, you have freedom and you are now to be a sharecropper, but like the difference between being a sharecropper and being a slave is almost non-existent. Like they weren't paid enough to be able to escape that situation. So you're essentially just And like when they're paying their sharecroppers, the money is essentially just going back to the person who paid them anyway because they have to pay for food, and they're going to do that through their employer in many cases. So it's
Like an endless cycle.
exactly.
Yeah, so basically sharecropping just like kept a lot of like African Americans in the South in just like
It's a legal
an
form of
entire
slavery.
cycle of just poverty.
Yeah. And I think that like straight after slavery ended, it was like slavery, sharecropping, and then they went into segregation for how long? Like they didn't. There was never really a point after slavery where they had like relief.
Yeah.
And like slavery is over, but where do you go from that? Where do you go from not being seen as a human and not like owning anything at all, not having any wealth, and you're just supposed to go into
Like,
regular society that's like not
like they never got a proper form of apology.
right.
And even like after segregation, like when you just recognize the systematic, like through government and higher powers, of just trying to decrease the opportunities and kind of destroy like African American communities. Like even once, like in the '60s, after the civil rights movement, there was a lot of progress, and then went into like the anti-drug and the war on drugs, which was not a war on drugs; it was a war on African American populations and those neighborhoods, because they weren't policing white neighborhoods. And the drugs in which they were going after was those predominantly accessible to African American communities because they were cheaper and more accessible, and like the whole crack thing was just cocaine. It was the same thing, but white people were just like snorting lines wherever they wanted,
Right.
but if you caught like someone crack, they're in prison for the next 20 years.
And then like the reason that there are like predominantly like black neighborhoods in like, for example, like in Buffalo, like the east side is like a predominantly
Yeah.
black neighborhood. But it was like made that way because of like racist housing practices, like redlining. So they'd like purposely be like, okay, like this is going to be like the predominantly like black part of like the neighborhood, and like purposely have like black people and like people of color in like a very specific part of like the city. And usually I think it was like these were considered like less safe zones or whatever.
And if you remember with the Jefferson shooting, the Jefferson Top shooting, that was the only grocery store in that neighborhood. It was seen as a bad neighborhood. If someone was planning on targeting black people, he was able to easily find where they would be just because of how segregated the communities are in Buffalo. Like I live on the west side, it's all Puerto Ricans, and then if you walk down the street, it's a nice neighborhood, and then if you walk further down the street, it's a bad neighborhood again. So it's kind of like everything is changing by just the block here on, I don't know.
Oh, that they'll do that. They'll be like, oh, like he or she was like, or they were like mentally ill, but like that's not an excuse to like
Right.
go into a school or like go into a grocery store and shoot 10 innocent people. That's not an
Based on the
excuse.
color of their skin.
Exactly.
And it was
Right.
and it was also well planned out,
Yeah.
thought out.
If you have a whole manifesto.
Right. I know that he was like 3 hours. He lives 3 hours away from here, so it was like definitely planned out because he came to this specific location to shoot out these specific people.
That kind of brings up the idea of like reparations too. Like should African Americans be paid back for like all the terrible things that happen? And will that ever happen? Personally, I don't see America doing that anytime in the near future. Not even in my lifetime. I don't think I could see it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like what Kadisha was saying, like there hasn't even been like a formal apology right yet. So like I feel like reparations is like so many like steps ahead of just like a simple like formal apology for that. And I feel like that's just like you have to like get to so many different like places ahead of that. Like before reparations happens, because if there's not like an apology, and like it just seems like that would be so far away.
And I just couldn't see it happening in this country where racism is so prominent. And there's so many people who are racist. And even if they don't say they are, there might be deep down, or they could do it without realizing it. So it's kind of like these people aren't going to view, like, obviously I think that people should get reparations, but a white man might not. I think like the last thing we can talk about is how we can mend from like the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade. That's something we have.
I don't think we really can. Just like it happened, there's no way to fix those problems, like, no matter how much you try to. Like, the fact that slavery will always be there, people, like, you can't erase those experiences and those, like, traumatic experiences. I don't think you really can do your best to, like, affect positive growth afterwards.
I think also a lot of people aren't even making the effort to. Like, the thing I always think about the most is the jewel in the what's it called?
In the British Museum.
The crown. How many times have those people asked for that back, and they still haven't given it back? So it's like if we want to mend from this, how can we if people aren't willing to? Like, it's the crown jewel, really. Like, you have so much money from the transatlantic slave trade that, like, it's just a never-ending cycle. I think there's no way of getting out of it.
And then I think in like the U.S. specifically, since like the U.S. is basically built on like racism because like it was built off of like slavery, and like slavery was what boosted the entire like southern economy, I guess.
Yeah.
Because like of plantations and like it was like I guess like the right climate for like having plantations and growing like crops. So like you sort of have to like go to the entire like root of the problem, but it's like I feel like we haven't really gotten to like the root of it because
I mean, it keeps going back and back because before that it was the Native Americans and the Comanches and stuff, and then they killed all of them and they had to bring them in. So it's like, where does it end? Because even before that, you can go to Europe and what they had going on there. Like, I feel like slavery has just been in our world in general forever.
like you would have to change the entire system because the U.S. is like entire I guess like system of doing things is racist.
And not just that, like, people still pass on, like, specifically, like, people still, like, pass on that mindset to their, their future generations, like, and then, like, there are times where, like, personally, I've experienced, like, you speak well, or American, you speak well. And like that kind of they don't know, they don't realize it because they just grew up with that mindset, but like that is racist, so what I'm trying to say is like even till this day it's still gonna carry on like this whole racism cycle, this whole, even though we're over with slavery, the racism.
Obviously, it's not.
Yeah, we still have some aspects.
So this was the Laptops on Top of Legs podcast.
Yeah.
With everybody here, where we discuss civilly disputes and conversations that complement the fantastic class of the future Doctor, Mr. James O'Neill White. This is episode 47. I'm Lee Mario.
I'm Naomi Hernandez.
I'm Khadija Nancy.
I'm Kathleen Mahoney.
And that's a wrap.